Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the dry heart of ancient Persia. You're not in your air-conditioned bedroom anymore, you're trudging across a flat, sun-baked desert, the kind of place where even the camels look annoyed. The sun isn't just shining, it's pressing down like a giant molten pancake. Your sandals squish ever so slightly into dust that's been sun-roasted since breakfast. The horizon is flat and shimmering, and you are dreaming of ice, not just any ice real, crunchy, hold against Choruscan ice. It's a kind that clinks in cups and numbs fingertips. Ain't the kind that has no business existing out here. And yet somehow, it did. You probably won't survive this trek, by the way, not in a tunic and leather water pouch. The average summer temperature in Yazd, let's just say your Fitbit would give up first. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sand crackles under your steps. There's not a tree in sight. And yet, there's a strange dome ahead. It looks out of place, like a giant upside-down ice cream cone rising from the earth. It shimmers faintly under the late afternoon sun. This is a yakshal, literally. An ice pit, structured thousands of years old, born out of necessity and refined by pure ingenuity. It's the ancient Persian answer to a deeply human question. How do you stay cool when everything wants to boil you alive? Imagine being a merchant or traveler 2,500 years ago. You've journeyed for days. Your throat is parched, your sandals are shredded, and your donkey smells like despair. But just when you think the heat might win, you reach a village. The elders invite you to rest inside the yakshal. They hand you a cold drink scented with rose water and maybe a hint of mint. Your body goes into sensory shock. Cold in the desert? How? The ancient Persians weren't playing around. They had no plastic insulation, no electricity, and no smart home features. And yet they managed to store literal tons of ice beneath domed mud brick roofs in the middle of one of the world's harshest climates. Now let's paint a clearer picture. These domes weren't just decorative. They rose 10 to 15 meters high, sometimes taller, with a deep pit dug beneath the surface. They were built from a magical mortar mixture called saruja, blend of clay, ash, egg whites, goat hair, and lime. Historians still argue whether the goat hair added structural strength or just made construction more aromatic inside the yakshal. The temperature remained startlingly low, cold enough to store ice made during frigid desert nights. These weren't just passive storage units. They were engines of survival. Now take a moment to really feel that. Interior, step through the narrow entrance. The sudden shade is disorienting. The air cools dramatically, almost suspiciously. Your body sighs with relief. You run your hand along the wall, cool, rough, and dry. Somewhere below, the pit stores ice blocks preserved by clever design and the ruthless laws of thermodynamics. These ice houses worked through a combination of deep insulation, nighttime freezing, and airflow manipulation. And don't worry, we'll be peeking into every one of those tricks in a minute. For now, just imagine this. You're standing in a mud dome in 400 BCE, sipping something sweet and cold, and outside. It's 100 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. There's a strange kind of stillness in here. Your breath echoes lightly. You can hear faint voices outside, merchants unloading carts, children laughing, a camel groaning in protest. Inside the yakshal, it's quiet, ancient quiet, designed quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you nap in the middle of a heat wave. And this wasn't a one-off miracle. Archaeologists have found these structures scattered across Iran, Yazd, Kerman, Kashan, and beyond. Some serve villages, some cities, and some even military outposts. But the thing is, they weren't just for emergencies. Ice, for the Persians, wasn't always a luxury. It was a part of daily life for many, especially the wealthy. They stored it, sold it, gifted it, and used it to chill their famously fragrant dishes and sweet syrups. And here's a sleepy little twist. Some scholars believe that in certain towns, entire summer festivals revolved around the ice delivery. Picture donkeys and carts, lining up like a medieval Amazon Prime, each cart carrying slabs of frozen luxury through blistering streets. It's astonishing, really. And it wasn't just brute force or trial and error. It was science observational. Slow-paced, sand-covered science. The kind that didn't need patents or electricity to prove its point. Just patience, clever engineering, and the will to drink something cold without inventing a freezer. As we linger inside this dome a little longer, let your mind drift to how different this must have felt to the people who built it. In the desert, shade, when the sun ruled everything. It was a quiet rebellion against the elements. Next, we'll take you even closer. You'll peek beneath the dome's surface, down into the pit, down into the past, and see how this beehive of mud managed to preserve a miracle. You're still standing beneath the dome. The air here doesn't move much, but it doesn't need to. It's already doing what it was designed to do. Stay still, stay dry, and stay cool. As you shift slightly on your feet, you feel it, that strange temperature gradient. Just a few steps from the outside furnace, and here you are chilling literally. Take a few more steps toward the edge of the pit, carefully. The floor slopes gently downward, spiraling into the belly of this ancient structure. That's not an accident, deliberate. Every curve, every brick, every shadow plays a part. The walls rise around you now, enveloping you in what feels like a silence older than memory. Look up the dome arches above, built not just for strength but to guide hot air away. Heat rises, after all, and the Persians knew that. They wanted it out. And now that you've stepped into the actual, it's time to really look at this structure, not just with sleepy wonder, but with your inner architecture nerd fully awakened. If you squint, you'll see that the mud brick layers aren't haphazard. They spiral upward in a pattern that suggests a deep understanding of airflow and pressure. And that special Saruj mortar we mentioned, it's still here, holding everything together centuries later. Apparently, the right mix of egg whites, ash, and goat hair really can stand the test of time. Historians still argue whether this mortar was passed down via secret recipe or just shared like Grandma's best cookie formula. Either way, it worked and still does. But let's talk about that shape. Why a dome? Why the inverted cone, narrowing below ground and flaring open above? Well, picture it this way. You're trying to trick the desert into leaving you alone. You want to trap cold and kick heat to the curb. A dome does both. It minimizes sun exposure and keeps the structure stable under pressure. Meanwhile, that underground pit, that's your ice bank. Subterranean vault where thick walls and earth insulation team up like ancient Batman and Robin. The deeper you go, the cooler it gets. By several meters underground, you're hitting stable temperatures that rarely climb above freezing, especially when layered with insulation. So when winter nights drop below zero, yes, even in the desert, the Persians went to work. Shallow pools with water under the open night sky waited for the stars to do their magic, and then voila ice formed. Not in huge industrial blocks, but thin, clean sheets. Imagine it. Peasants and ice makers shuffling barefoot across frozen pools under the stars, whispering jokes. Shivering, harvesting fragile sheets of ice with care and haste before the sun. Returned, they'd carry the sheets by hand or cart and lower them into the Yakshul's belly. Stack them, pack them in straw. Seal the entrance, and then, wait, if it sounds like a sacred ritual, it sort of was. After all, they were making ice. In the desert, using starlight, if that's not slow burn magic, what is? Now, take a moment to touch the packed straw. It's dry, smells faintly sweet, and it's surprisingly effective at keeping the cold in and moisture out. Plus, it's cheap, renewable, soft underfoot, and yes, occasionally home to sleepy desert mice. The upper walls of the dome weren't just for show either. Sometimes had small vents or openings at the top, angled just right to let heat escape while cold air settled below. Persian architects had a weirdly precise understanding of fluid dynamics, centuries before anyone gave it a name. And don't forget the color. These domes weren't dark. They were often covered in a pale sand-colored plaster or left naturally bright to reflect sunlight. It's the same principle behind wearing white in summer except, multiplied by 10 meters of ancient engineering. As you sit for a moment on a ledge carved into the wall, something odd happens. You forget where you are. It could be midnight. It could be dawn. The air here doesn't care. It doesn't move or warn you of time. This is by design, too. The actual is a time capsule not just of ice, but of rhythm. It's a beat in the life of ancient Persia that slowed things down. Meanwhile, your modern mind might still be racing, but how did they know how to build this? That's the thing, they didn't have computer models or laser levels. But they had generations of trial and error, careful observation, and probably a few mistakes. That ended with very expensive puddles. One popular theory suggests that early yakshuls evolved from basic cellars and grain pits. Over time, necessity and climate nudged their design towards something much more specialized. The desert demanded more, and the Persians answered. They didn't waste materials either. Leftover mud became bricks. Failed pools turned into gardens. The yakshul itself often doubled as storage for perishables, dried fruits, dairy, or even some precursors to ice cream. That's really frozen dairy with rosewater and crushed nuts, the good stuff. But more on that later. For now, you're sitting quietly beneath a dome that defied nature, built by hands that understood both sun and shadow. You're surrounded by walls that breathe just enough, by pits that remember the cold, and by a legacy of cooling that lasted for millennia. And as you glance upward, past the faintly spiraling brickwork, and out toward the pale light slipping through the vent above, you wonder how many others have sat right here, thousands of years ago, feeling the same cold floor under their palms. You're still there, seated against the cool interior of the actual, but now your curiosity stirs. It's not enough to know what the structure does. You want to know how. How does a dome made of dirt keep something as fleeting as ice from vanishing into steam in the middle of summer? Let's break this down. Take a deep breath. Pretend you're an ancient Persian engineer, not with a slide rule, but with sunburnt hands, calloused feet, and the kind of patience that only comes from working under the same sun every day of your life. First, there's the air. The stillness you feel inside isn't accidentally, it's carefully cultivated. Yakshuls were often situated with their openings angled away from prevailing winds, which kept hot desert gusts from rushing in. Instead of ventilation, they focused on insulation. The fewer drafts, the less heat intrusion. The dome traps the coolness like a secret. Next, evaporation. Now this is where things get clever. If you're standing outside the yakshul during a desert evening, you'd see shallow pools or channels nearby, specially dug to hold thin layers of water. The desert has a secret weapon at night, plummeting temperatures. In places like Yazd, where this technology thrived, winter nights could dip well below freezing. The Persians seized that opportunity. They waited until nightfall, filled the pools, and let nature do its work. Thin water sheets freeze quickly. By morning, the workers would gently collect these plates of ice and move them underground. Some theories suggest they used slight inclines to slide the ice directly into pizza, sort of low-tech ice chute. Other historians believe they used pulleys and ramps. Historians still argue. Whether the largest yakshuls were communal projects or managed by elite families with the resources to oversee ice harvesting, either way, it took coordination, manpower, and a deep knowledge of local conditions. But back to evaporation. Inside the dome, moisture control mattered. Straw or sawdust helped insulate the ice and also kept the air inside relatively dry. Less moisture in the air meant less heat transfer. When water evaporates, it draws heat away, one reason why your sweat cools you down. The yakshul used that principle in reverse. It kept everything so dry that the ice simply refused to melt. Now run your hands along the inner wall. It feels slightly chalky. That's the saruj, remember? Mix of clay, lime, ash, sand, and sometimes egg whites or goat hair. You may giggle at the recipe, but the result is a water-resistant plaster that could endure heat waves and centuries of neglect. It's so effective that some modern eco-builders are experimenting with similar mixtures today. Step outside again. The sun's just started to dip, casting long shadows across the desert. It's not cool by any means, but it's tolerable. Look around the base of the dome. See those small channels? They're part of the temperature control strategy. Channels directed meltwater away from the structure, keeping the base dry and preventing any sneaky heat from creeping in through damp soil. And now, the final piece of this beautifully lo-fi puzzle, orientation. The best yakshuls were built with astronomical awareness. The pools were placed in shaded areas or designed to maximize sky exposure during the coldest part of the night. Builders aligned features with prevailing wind patterns, using terrain and timing like tools. Remember, they didn't have temperature sensors or climate charts. They had stars, experience, and a whole lot of trial and error. You stretch a bit. Now, step out farther into the desert air and feel the warmth return. It's like stepping out of a shaded pool into a sauna. A donkey brays somewhere in the distance. Dust swirls. And here's the fun part. These yakshuls weren't just hiding ice. In many cases, they stored perishables, dairy, fruits, herbs. Think of them as multi-purpose walk-in fridges powered by physics and clever design. The ice helped regulate internal temps. In return, the structure preserved food far longer than it should have been possible. There are whispers among some scholars' fringe. One's sure that early versions of Bastani Sanati, that's Persian saffron ice cream, for the uninitiated, were served straight from yakshuls during elite feasts. It wasn't Häagen-Dazs, but it was rich, cold, and delicately flavored with rose water, cardamom, or pistachio. And it makes sense. A combination of ice, dairy, and floral syrups would have been the most luxurious palate cooler imaginable in a climate like this. But not everyone got to indulge. Ice had its hierarchy. The wealthiest families controlled larger yakshuls. Others bartered for access or relied on seasonal community stores. Ice was power quiet, clear and melting if mismanaged as you look. Back at the dome's silhouette now, sharper under the setting sun, you begin to appreciate it, not just as a building, but as a philosophy. It's not flashy. It doesn't defy physics. It uses physics. Gently, respectfully. It reminds you that comfort doesn't always require excess. Sometimes all it takes is mud, time, and knowing when to let the night do your work. You step back outside as the desert sky slips into evening. The sun is lowering, casting the world in golds and rusts, and the temperature drops just enough for your lungs to relax. And now you get to witness the most enchanting part of this whole operation, ice making by moonlight. You walk past the yakshul and follow a narrow footpath flanked by low mud brick walls. Ahead lies a shallow rectangular basin carved directly into the earth. The basin is wide, but only ankle deep, like a sleepy puddle waiting for something to happen. Nearby, a few figures in wool cloaks are gently pouring water from clay jars, spreading it out in smooth, shimmering sheets. No rushing, no splashing, just a quiet, methodical rhythm. This is the art of making ice without machines. Let's paint the scene. It's winter in ancient Persia. And you're standing near Yazd or Kerman. The air is dry. Bone dry. Humidity's a joke here. But at night, the temperature can drop dramatically low enough to freeze standing water if you know what you're doing. The Persian engineers certainly knew. They built these shallow pools right next to the yakshul, aligned carefully to the north so they'd receive as little sunlight as possible. Shaded by low walls during the day and fully exposed to the open sky at night, these pools became nature's freezer trays. Now, why thin layers? Simple, thinner water freezes faster. That's important when your window is short. A few hours after sunset, with the air rapidly cooling and no cloud cover to trap warmth, the surface of these pools would begin to glaze over. You might even hear it tiny pops and cracks as the molecules give up their liquid dreams by morning. Workers, probably villagers, possibly hired laborers, would be out there before sunrise, cutting the ice with curved metal tools. Sometimes wooden tongs, but always carefully. And always before the sun crept back over the hills, they'd carry it to the yakshul in baskets lined with straw or wool. Piece by piece, the ice was stacked in the central pit like fragile treasure. Some days, only a few layers could be harvested. On colder nights, jackpot. You bend down beside one of these frozen basins. Imagine reaching in and brushing the delicate sheet of ice with your fingertips. Smooth, cold, temporary. There's a strange satisfaction in that contrast, the most fleeting thing in the world, gathered and preserved through ancient patience. But the real magic isn't just in the water. It's in what's below your feet. Beneath the ground lies a secret network, a quiet, invisible system that made this whole operation even more effective. These were the Connaughts underground aqueducts dug with terrifying precision. Historians still argue whether the first Connaughts originated in Persia or were adapted from earlier civilizations, but no one doubts their genius. Imagine a tunnel system carved by hand, stretching for kilometers under hills and deserts, maintaining a gentle slope the entire way, sometimes only 1 meter of drop for every 100 meters of length. It brought cold, clean water from mountain aquifers into desert cities and towns. Connaughts weren't just water delivery systems, they were cool water delivery systems. Protected from the sun, flowing slowly underground, the water would arrive already cold. That water could be directed into the shallow, freezing pools or used to regulate the temperature inside the yakshal. Some advanced yakshals had connections directly to Connaughts, ensuring their stored ice and food remained cool through even the most brutal summer days. Now imagine what that meant for a community. You're a baker. Your clay oven keeps the shop hot even in winter. But thanks to the Connaught-fed yakshal, you can offer chilled drinks or store perishables longer. Or maybe you're a doctor, keeping herbal infusions fresh for longer treatments. Or a merchant selling preserved fruits across vast distances, knowing they'll arrive unspoiled. It wasn't just comfort, it was infrastructure. One of the more charming theories, though admittedly light on hard evidence, is that some nighttime workers would sing quietly as they collected the ice, both to keep rhythm and to ward off wolves. Whether true or not, it paints a beautiful picture. Moonlight glinting on icy surfaces, distant song drifting over the sand, breath fogging in the cold. And here's something that might surprise you. Not all of this was seasonal. In some regions, ice production continued year-round. If the nights stayed cool enough, if a process didn't stop, the volumes were smaller. Sure, but it speaks to how attuned the ancient Persians were to their environment. They understood not just heat and cold, but timing. They didn't waste energy fighting nature, they worked with it. Let the sun scorch by day, let the stars freeze by night. That was the rhythm. That was the plan. You sit beside one of the now empty basins, knees pulled to your chest. You can still see faint scratches along the stone rim, marks left by centuries of hand scraping, pouring, collecting. The moon rises higher now, painting the yakshal in soft silver. It looks less like a structure and more like a sleeping giant. And as the wind picks up slightly, brushing past you with a cool whisper, you realize this whole thing, this ancient process of freezing water in the desert, relied on patience, petition, and deep respect for subtlety. No compressors, no blinking. Buttons. No noise. Just moonlight, shallow pools, and enough stillness to let water remember how to freeze. You sit still by the ice pool a while longer, your body adjusting to the calm desert air. It's cooler, now pleasant even, but there's something below. You, beneath the cracked surface and quiet hush of sand and stone, that hums with hidden life. It's time to talk about the secret arteries of ancient Persia, the Connaughts. Stand up and follow a narrow, dusty trail just beyond the yakshal. Soon you reach a small hill mound, really with a strange circle of stones at its top. In the middle is a dark, narrow shaft, like the eye of the earth peeking back at you. You lean slightly over the edge and feel it. A faint draft of cool air, rising like a sigh from the underworld. You're looking into a mother well. This is where the Connaught begins, dug deep into an aquifer, sometimes more than 100 meters below the surface. From here, an entire system of gently sloping underground tunnels fans outward, like fingers tracing paths beneath villages, farms, even mountains. Connaughts were one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world. No pumps, no metal piping, just pickaxes, water levels, and an astonishing amount of patience. Imagine you're a worker on one of these crews. You wake before dawn, tie a rope around your waist, and descend into a cramped, pitch-black tunnel barely tall enough to kneel. In, you work by oil lamp or blind touch, chipping at stone and earth for weeks, months, sometimes years. A miscalculation of just a few centimeters over kilometers of tunnel? Total disaster. The slope has to be perfect. Historians still argue whether workers used early trigonometry or simply refined generations of empirical measurements. But either way, the precision is jaw-dropping. Some cannot stretched over 60 kilometers, and yet the water always moved slowly, gently, steadily from source to town, pulled only by gravity. No pumps, no magic. Just the earth and minds sharp enough to listen to it. Walk a little farther, and you come upon another vertical shaft, one of the many access wells used by workers to remove debris and allow ventilation. From above, the line of these circular openings marches across the land like a trail of pockmarks. To the untrained eye, they might look like old meteorite scars, but really, they're mile markers of ingenuity. Now here's the sleepy wonder. Of it all, the Conquests didn't just bring water to the Actuals. They brought cold water. Protected underground from the brutal sun, the water retained its natural mountain chill. By the time it emerged near a village or storage dome, it was already cool enough to aid in refrigeration. And it wasn't just for drinking or irrigation. You remember those shallow ice pools we visited? Conquests often fed them directly, ensuring a steady, slow trickle that could freeze by nightfall. Inside the Actual, some builders included narrow canals connected to the Conquest, allowing chilled water to circulate around the stored ice-like nature's own radiator system. It stabilized the internal temperature, warded off moisture buildup, helped keep perishables fresh longer. In fact, some scholars believe that ice wasn't even the main goal in certain towns. The Actual served as a refrigeration hub, cooling everything from dairy to herbs to important documents. Even paperwork needed pampering in Persia. And here's a quirky twist. In some regions, small rooms or alcoves were carved off from the main tunnel of a Conquest. People would sit inside during summer, a sort of ancient air conditioning lounge. Imagine that. Crouching in a carved rock nook beneath the ground, sipping sour cherry juice in July, cooled by the gentle breath of subterranean water as you walk. Now, beside a stretch of open terrain, you notice how every few meters there's another of those vent holes. You start to see the terrain differently, not flat and barren, but laced with hidden rivers and ghostly infrastructure. And these weren't abandoned after the classical period. Many Conquests operated well into the 20th century. Some still do. In places like Iran, Afghanistan, and Oman, these systems continue to irrigate fields, feed fountains, and cool homes. Of course, maintaining them is no small feat. Over the centuries, many collapsed or were deliberately sealed when electric pumps took over. But in recent years, a slow movement has begun to reintroduce Conquests as sustainable. Low-energy alternatives for water management in dry climates. You reach a small mud brick building at the end of your walk. Its floor is partially collapsed, revealing a tunnel below the dark curve of a Conquest. Still whispering water centuries later, you lower yourself just enough to feel the air. It's like opening a refrigerator door, only this one hums with age. The idea that this water may have traveled over 10 kilometers through a tunnel dug entirely by hand is humbling. As night thickens over the desert, you begin your walk back. Toward the Actual, it stands in the distance, silent and steady, lit by starlight now. But you see it differently, less like a singular marvel, and more like the final note in a symphony of clever, quiet infrastructure. The Conquests, invisible and tireless, kept that dome alive. They were the veins to its heart, and as your feet crunched softly over packed earth, you realize something else. The ancient Persians didn't just survive the desert. They read it, listened to it, partnered with it. They didn't conquer nature. They collaborated, and maybe that's why thousands of years later, their cool breath still rises beneath your feet. You make your way back to the Actual, under a velvet sky dusted with stars. The dome rises ahead like a sleeping giant, its silhouette dark against the faintest shimmer of moonlit clouds. But tonight, you're not just gazing at a structure. You're thinking about the people who built it. Who were these master builders of mud and math? Let's start with what we know. The typical construction of a yachtshul was no casual DIY project. It required a specialized team of architects, masons, and laborers, each trained in techniques passed down over generations. Many of them never wrote a word about their knowledge. It was taught hand to hand, mud brick to mud brick. You walk along the outer base of the dome, tracing the gently sloping foundation. You see the seams between the bricks, almost perfect but just irregular, enough to whisper human hands. The bricks themselves were made on site. It's often using the same sarouge plaster mix we mentioned earlier. Sarouge, that weird but wonderful cocktail of clay, sand, ash, lime, egg whites, and goat hair. What sounds like a recipe for a haunted omelet turned out to be one of the most durable, waterproof materials of the ancient world. The lime acted as a binder. The ash gave strength. The egg whites and hair added elasticity. The final product, a plaster so tough it could survive desert heat, seasonal floods, and centuries of silence. Historians still argue whether sarouge was used exclusively for yachtchuls or had broader architectural applications. Some suggest it was considered a sacred material, reserved for structures tied to community well-being, houses, reservoirs, and even some shrines. Others argue that it was just practical, and when you're dealing with 120 degrees Fahrenheit summers, practicality is sacred. Now imagine the builders mixing this concoction. Two men stand barefoot in a pit, ankle deep in goopy mortars, stirring it with long wooden paddles. Over in the shade, others shape bricks in wooden molds, lining them up under woven mats to dry. It's a choreography of sweat and timing. They work early in the day, and again late in the afternoon, always dancing around the sun. One mistake, one poorly cured brick, and the structure might buckle years down the line. No one's interested in a dome full of ice becoming a dome full of disappointment. There's a legend, half whispered and probably embroidered over time, that the best yachtshul builders could taste when the mix was right. Just a dab on the tongue told them whether the lime ratio was balanced or if the egg white needed adjusting. No, we don't recommend this technique for your next home renovation, but it does give you a sense of how personal and physical this knowledge was. Look closely at the brickwork again. Notice the spiral? It's not just aesthetic flair, it's structural brilliance. The spiral pattern distributes weight evenly and allows hot air rising inside to move upward in a slow, swirling motion before escaping through a vent at the top. The builders likely began construction by digging the pit deep enough to house the ice and line it with straw insulation. Then, they'd build a circular foundation, carefully packed to resist shifting sands. From there, the dome grew brick by brick, spiraling upward, narrowing as it climbed. No scaffolding, no cranes, just earthen ramps and ladders woven from rope. And palmwood once completed, the yachtshul was tested through its first freeze cycle. The builders would supervise the first season of ice making, monitoring the structure's ability to retain cold, shed heat, and hold its own against desert storms. And here's a detail you might have missed. Many yachtchuls had drainage channels. At the base, not just for meltwater, but for emergency meltwater. If the temperature inside rose unexpectedly, say, during an unusually hot spring, the structure would divert water away from the walls to prevent erosion or collapse. That kind of foresight didn't come from guesswork. It came from lived experience. Some modern researchers believe that these builders employed early forms of thermal mapping, placing their hands on various parts of the structure throughout the day to track how heat moved. Over time, they would adjust design elements, wider vents, thicker walls, deeper pits, and they worked with local materials. Builders in Yazd might use a slightly different recipe than those in Kerman, depending on the clay, the ash from local plants, or even the types of goat hair available. Each dome was custom, adapted to its environment like a desert lizard adjusting to the sand. There's even evidence, though, again, debated that yachtshul builders had a kind of guild system. Masters trained apprentices. Territories were respected. And once a dome was finished, its builders were honored with gifts or feasts. Maybe even a few ladles of chilled sherbet as thanks. You lean now against the outer wall, feeling its rough texture against your palm. Somewhere in this very dome centuries ago, craftsman placed his final brick and stepped back in silence, knowing that his work might outlive him and many others, and it did. These ice houses weren't just practical marvels, they were monuments to collaborative skill, patience, and the kind of generational wisdom that rarely gets written down, but always shows up in clay and sweat and shadow. In our age of smart thermostats and voice-activated air conditioning, it's easy to forget what it means to truly understand your environment. These builders didn't plug into anything. They tuned into everything: heat, light, time, material, and because of that, you can still walk here. Still press your hand to the same sun-warmed surface. Still feel the coolness, the cleverness, the care. The stars now hang heavier in the sky, and your eyes adjust to the kind of darkness that only ancient places can offer. No glow from cities, no hum of power lines, just the vast hush of desert night and the whisper of wind over dust. You sit beside the Yakshals Foundation, close enough to touch its story, and begin to think not just about ice or engineering, but about routine, daily life, because beyond the architectural brilliance and clever physics, Yakshals were part of the everyday rhythm of Persian communities. They weren't marvels to be admired from afar, were used, visited, relied upon. Let's say you live in a nearby village in the 16th century. You're not a merchant or noble, you're a mother of three. It's late spring, and the temperature's climbing fast. Your youngest has a cough that won't quit, and you're convinced some cooled rose water will soothe her. So, the early morning, you walk down the dusty path to the Yakshal with a clay jug wrapped in linen. A boy from your neighborhood passes you with a shallow basket of herbs. His mother wants to keep them from wilting. Near the dome, a small cluster of neighbors waits their turn. Access is regulated, but not strict. Each family pays into its upkeep through labor, goods, or koinand gets their share of the cold. A teenager emerges from the dome, cheeks flushed from the contrast in temperature, and gestures you inside. Step in. You lower your voice. Everyone does here. It's like entering a quiet cathedral of climate. You unstopper your jug and fill it with ice chips. Not much, just enough. You wrap it again and step outside, into a world that already feels warmer. This kind of ritual was part of life. The Yakshal wasn't just a place to fetch ice, it was woven into seasonal routines, especially in regions like Yazd or Bam, where temperatures regularly soared beyond 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, closing parenthesis, think of the butcher, storing fresh cuts in baskets packed with straw and cooled against blocks of ice, or the baker's assistant who brings trays of dough to rest in the cool before baking, or the weaver who soaks cotton threads in chilled water to prevent shrinkage as she dyes. These aren't dramatic moments. They're gentle, repetitive, as sleep-friendly as history gets, and it wasn't just food and fabric. Herbalists stored delicate roots and dried blossoms in small clay pots inside the Yakshal. A particular favorite, the Li Mohammeda damask rose petals used in perfumes and tonics. Preserved properly, it'd stay fragrant for months. Some scholars suggest that a few Yakshals even functioned as informal gathering spots during summer. Imagine a shaded platform built near the structure. A few neighbors sit with cups of cooled barley water secondibent while their children nap nearby. Someone fans themselves lazily. Someone else tells a story about the year. The ice nearly melted before Harvest Festival. And that brings us to festivals. Ice was more than practical, it was celebratory. Its major Persian festivals, especially Nowruz, the New Year, often featured sweet treats and chilled drinks. The wealthy would hire vendors to serve faluda-thin rice noodles frozen with syrup, rosewater, and lime. The ice came straight from the Yakshal, of course. Not everyone had equal access. Class played a role. The wealthiest families had private storage spaces within the dome or even small personal Yakshals near their estates. But most domes served entire neighborhoods, and in lean years, community came first. There's a mild irony here, one that modern visitors often miss. In a place so hot, where survival often meant shade and stillness, the most coveted luxury was cold. Not gold. Not jewels. Cold. You walk now along the side of the dome, tracing the subtle curves of its structure. The walls are thick, sometimes over 2 meters, and still faintly warm from the day. But inside, the cold holds steady. Can almost sense it like a ghost curled in the pit, sleeping until morning. And here's a small but lovely fact. Some yakshals featured small niches, or ledges, along their interior walls, where villagers could briefly store things while they waited their turn. A jug of water, a sack of herbs, covered tray of something sweet. Imagine the trust it took to leave something like that in the dark, unattended. Historians still argue whether these community yakshals operated under formal oversight or were maintained through informal consensus. In many regions, a village, elder or religious leader acted as caretaker. In others, it rotated its family, contributing time and materials for upkeep, and upkeep was constant. Cracks needed sealing. Straw needed replacing. Drainage channels required clearing. It was a living structure, and like anything alive, it needed care. Even in death, yakshals had dignity. When no longer in use, some were repurposed, turned into storage for grains, shelters for animals, even shrines. Others were simply left alone, admired for their endurance, visited by travelers in awe. You pause now, watching as a fox scampers across the low dunes. It pauses at the far side of the yakshal, sniffs at a crumbling drainage spout, and disappears into the dark. You smile. Nature, still respecting the structure, still weaving around it, and you, still wandering through history. Feel the rhythm of this place settle into your bones. Morning trips for ice, afternoon gossip by the wall, moonlit harvesting. Under starlit silence, these domes weren't grand palaces. They weren't monuments to conquest. They were quiet, useful, enduring. And somehow, that makes them feel even more miraculous. You're beginning to notice something now, something subtle, something comforting. The deeper you walk into this old desert life, the more the rhythm settles into you. The gentle logic of ancient Persian days. Mornings wrapped in chill, afternoons spent chasing shade, evenings quiet and cool. Tonight, you step once more inside the yakshal, not to fetch anything, just to sit. The thick air wraps around you, not suffocating, just hushed, like a blanket with memory. And as your eyes adjust to the dark again, you begin to think about the seasons, the long arc of the year that dictated how these ice houses worked and how the people around them lived. Because the yakshal was in TA, a static thing. It was seasonal, cyclical light story tied to the changing sky. Let's begin with winter, the great season of ice. You already know about the shallow basins and the moonlit freeze. But what you might not know is how carefully winter was watched. Farmers could afford to wait for frost. The ice makers, they needed it. One warm season, and an entire community's cold reserve would vanish before midsummer. So elders tracked the weather with obsessive attention. The first signs of dry, northern winds, the hard bite of a morning breeze, the particular clarity of a night sky, all clues. In some towns, small rituals even marked the start of ice season. A bowl of water left on a rooftop. If it froze solid by dawn, the yakshal team would gather cloaks tight, teeth chattering, grinning like madmen at the promise of frozen treasure. And then the work began. Night after night, water poured. Ice formed. Workers scraped it up and packed it into the pit. Layer upon layer, separated by straw. You can almost hear the crunch of footsteps across fresh sheets of ice. By spring, the dome was full. Not to the top, but close. It's enough to last the coming heat. But that's when the real test began. Spring was sly. It could be soft and cool, or it could leap straight to scorch. Yakshal caretakers checked interior temperatures daily, using hands, breath, and even the feel of the walls. Too warm, they opened upper vents at night to let trapped heat escape. To dry, they adjusted the straw packing to prevent cracking. And summer was siege season, as the yakshal became a fortress, and the sun a relentless invader. You step out now, just imagining it walking through the heart of July. The air hot enough to fry bread on stone, but knowing that in the center of the actual, there was still cold. Not freezer cold, but cool enough to drink, to soothe, to feel human again. Children were often sent on early morning errands before the sun reached its high roar. They'd scamper barefoot down packed earth paths, baskets swinging, ice clinking like treasure. Mothers stored cooled rice pudding or rosewater drinks in clay jars beside the thickest blocks. Artisans dipped hands in chilled water before returning to their crafts. Merchants laid silks beside slabs of ice to keep the fibers soft and unwrinkled. There's something almost meditative about it, isn't there? It's this idea that entire routines flowed in and out of the actual like breath. Inhale, exhale, effort, relief. And then comes autumn. The great exhale. The heat begins to wane. Ice is mostly gone by now, but if the harvests were good, few final bricks remain in the lower pit, melted into small, sacred puddles. The actual workers sweep the floor, replace straw, scrape mold from walls. A season of cold has passed, and the dome prepares to sleep. Sometimes villagers hold small ceremonies to mark the change. A pot of saffron rice is shared, chilled slightly with the last of the ice. A prayer of thanks is whispered not to the dome, not exactly, but to what it represents, endurance, planning the miracle of cool in a sea of heat. And maybe this is the real magic. Not just that the actual stored ice, but that it gave people time. Time to think, time to preserve, time to savor. You sit again inside the dome, imagining how the air felt in August compared to January. You picture the ice mound, shrinking each day like a slowly melting candle, and how carefully it was rationed. Historians still debate whether ice from different seasons had different values. Was winter's ice purer? Did early harvest blocks command more respect? No one knows for sure, but one thing's certain. It meant something. Every shard that remained into the hot months was proof. Proof that the system worked. People had planned, labored, and survived. And perhaps that's what a yakshal is. At its core, a calendar of care. It doesn't tick or chime. It doesn't beep or buzz. But if you learn to read it, season by season, it tells you everything. You stay inside the yakshal a little longer, letting your thoughts stretch into the cool hush. Outside, the desert world remains dark, but you begin to hear it a distant owl call. The soft brushing of wind against sand, the subtle creak of wood from a cart perhaps long abandoned. As you trace your hand along the inner curve of the dome, the story of the yakshal broadens. Because, eventually, every great system attracts admiration, imitation, and competition. And so we come to trade. You may not expect it, but ice wasn't just a domestic luxury, it was a commodity. Stored ice, chilled syrups, even frozen desserts moved between cities and towns, especially in the more temperate regions of Persia. Some of it, yes, came from yakshals. But even beyond these domes, there were ice pits, ice wagons, and seasonal markets where coolness had real economic value. Imagine this. It's midsummer. You're in a bustling bazaar in Isfahan. The air smells of cumin and baked dates. You wipe sweat from your brow as you weave through stalls textiles to your left, copperware to your right, and like a desert. Mirage, you spot a man selling chilled tamarind water from an urn wrapped in damp cloth and straw. You look closer. There's a cart parked in the shade behind him, lined with slabs of ice, wrapped in wool and covered with canvas. 2 donkeys chew lazily nearby. The vendor cracks a smile and hands you a cup beaded with condensation. That ice? It came from 90 miles away. Hauled before dawn, moved with care, and sold to people willing to pay for 10 seconds of bliss. It sounds extravagant, maybe, but think about it. Cold is relief. Cold is status. Cold is escape. And in a world where heat defined the tempo of life, a block of ice became a miniature miracle. Of course, transporting it was no joke. Enter the ice caravans. Teams of merchants organized special journeys from colder regions, mountain villages, high-altitude farms, to cities and towns in need. Ice was packed in straw, wrapped in sheep wool, and often moved at night to minimize melting. Historians still argue whether some of these merchants used salt to slow melting. Some say yes, citing fragments of trade ledgers and descriptions from travelers. Others insist it was all straw, shadow, and skillful timing. What we do know is this. ice became part of the trade economy. And where trade flows, culture follows. For example, during the Qajar dynasty in the 19th century, there are records of elaborate summer banquets in Tehran where chilled deserts were the highlight. It's fruit sorbets, rosewater jellies, bowls of saffron. Faluda all kept cool, using ice from distant domes and pits. Diplomats from Europe took note. Some found it charming. Others were quietly envious. Persia, they realized, had solved a problem they were still wrestling with. Now, if you go further back, say, to the Achaemenid era, there are hints that ice and snow were stored in mountain pits for royal use. Darius the Great didn't have a yakchal, but he certainly understood the luxury of cool, and the idea spread. You can find yakchal-like structures in Afghanistan, Pakistan, parts of northern India, and even along the Silk Road routes deep into Central Asia. Were they exact copies? No. But the principles: insulation, evaporation, timing echo, the Persian method. Trade didn't just carry goods, it carried methods. And so you begin to see the yakchal not just as a building, but as a node in a much larger system, cooling on the map of global ingenuity. Step back outside now. The sky is just beginning to pale at the edge, the softest suggestion of dawn curling over the horizon. The yakchal stands before you, and in your mind's eye, you imagine all the others like it dotting valleys, flanking old roads half buried in sand, yet still standing. Once, a merchant named Asgar packed his donkey cart with ice from this very dome and set out toward the city. His daughter ran behind him for a minute, waving a cloth bundle of dates as a snack. The road was long, and the ice wouldn't last the day, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that someone somewhere would hold a chilled drink that afternoon and sigh. And that sigh would travel all the way back here, like a thank you whispered on the breeze, as the first light of morning brushes the tips of distant hills. You stretch your arms slowly, feeling the cool air of night slipping away. The yakchal before you is still cloaked in shadows, its surface just beginning to glow faintly with dawn. But before you leave this quiet sanctuary of mud, brick, and wisdom, there's one more angle worth exploring, perhaps the most surprising of all. The science, because the ancient Persians, while perhaps not using lab coats or beakers, understood thermodynamics in a way that would make a modern engineer raise an eyebrow with admiration. Let's walk through it together, not as a list of formulas, but as a gentle unraveling of natural rules, revealed through patient experimentation and deep respect for observation. Start with the dome. Why a dome? Well, yes, it's beautiful, symmetrical, solid, but more importantly, it moves heat. Rather, it resists it. The rounded shape of the yakchal allowed hot air to rise naturally toward the apex, where a narrow vent or bagir wind catcher would allow it to escape. At the same time, the lower levels of the dome, and particularly the underground pit, remained dense with cold, shielded from external airflow. It's a slow cooling ballet. Warm air out, cold air in. No fans, no freon, just the steady churn of convection. The thickness of the walls? Another brilliant move. Often more than 2 meters thick at the base, they were made from dense, heat-resistant materials like sarujar, goat hair, andaguite, superstar, and local clay, which absorbed heat slowly, releasing it just as slowly overnight. Historians still argue whether the builders intuitively understood the concept of thermal inertia, or whether it was discovered simply by trial and error. Either way, the result was the same. A kind of thermal. Battery charged each night with cool, discharged throughout the day without a sound. Then there's evaporation. Oh yes, the ancient Persians were playing with phase change physics before it had a name. See, the yakchal was in tea just keeping. Cold in it was actively making things cooler by encouraging water to evaporate. Let's go back to those shallow basins. Thin sheets of water, spread out under a dry night sky, begin to evaporate. As they do, they lose energy, heat energy. The result? The remaining water becomes cooler. If conditions are right, it even freezes. Inside the yakchal, a similar process plays out on the dome's surface. Occasionally moistened with water, the plaster exterior of the dome allowed for some evaporative cooling as well. A breeze across damp clay. It's your ancient air conditioner. You lean against the wall now, just outside the dome, and marvel at how much of this brilliance was achieved without thermometers, without equations, without blueprints. They used what they had: keen senses, consistency, community feedback, the orientation of the dome, almost always facing north to minimize sunlight exposure, the surrounding walls and shade structures, designed to cast cooling shadows on the freezing pools. Every angle, every brick, had purpose. One of the more fringe theories, still debated in quiet corners of academic conferences, suggests that some actual sites were chosen based on subtle dips in the Earth's temperature, small microclimates where wind patterns or soil type gave a slight cooling edge. It's hard to prove, but certainly not impossible after all. You've already learned how much they listened to the land. Now here's a playful fact. Some builders, especially in later periods, would test the inner air circulation by lighting. In sense and tracking the smoke, it spiraled gently upward and out. All was well. If it lingered or reversed direction, they'd adjust vent openings, or even reshape parts of the dome's throat. Imagine doing all that with nothing but your eyes, your nose, and an enormous amount of stubbornness. And all this was done with sustainability in mind. It's not the buzzword kind, but the real kind. Zero carbon, zero waste. Materials from the earth return to the earth. No plastic, no power draw, no hum of machinery, just an agreement between humans and heat. Now, let's zoom out. Think about what this structure actually did. It preserved food, it created ice in the desert, it cooled air passively, it stored perishables for entire communities, and it did all this silently, with zero maintenance contracts. Over the course of centuries, you might say that's not just science, that's wisdom. And now, as you step back from the dome, the sun cresting the far ridge paints everything in a soft gold. The bricks seem to glow from within. The desert, silent and slow, stretches out around you, and for a brief moment the world feels aligned. Aligned with heat, aligned with history, aligned with the ancient, quiet art of keeping cool without ever pressing a single button. The morning light spreads further now, revealing soft shadows between rocks and the uneven footprints you left near the dome's entrance. You take one last deep breath inside the cool cavity of the actual, letting it fill your chest, as if trying to bottle that stillness and carry it forward. But you're not quite ready to leave yet. There's something else tugging at the edge of your thoughts, something personal. You begin to wonder, who were the people who kept these places running, year after year, generation after generation? Not just the builders or the architects, but the quiet stewards of cold, the caretakers, the ice whisperers. Step outside and imagine a man named Reza. Let's say he lived around 1730 in a small desert town where the yakshal was both necessity and pride. Reza is in his 60s, his back curved from decades of labor, his fingers toughened by years of hauling blocks of ice and smoothing sarouge over wind-worn bricks. He's not famous. No records of his name will survive. Everyone in town knows him. Reza's the one who wakes before dawn to check the dome's temperature. He taps the walls with his knuckles, listening for dampness. He tests the straw layers with 2 fingers, checking for any signs of mold or settling. He wipes dust from the vent holes and nods in quiet approval when the air inside smells clean like cold clay and faint damp straw. Children call him Amu Yakchal, Uncle Icehouse, and it's not just a job. It's an inheritance. His father did it before him, and his father before that. The techniques they know aren't written anywhere. They're in the way Reza squints at the clouds, the way he places his palm flat on the dome and waits for exactly 10 seconds before saying, "It's going to be a good freeze tonight." In many towns, families like Reza's became unofficial keepers of the dome. They weren't always paid in coins. Sometimes they received goods, a jug of fresh yogurt, a bolt of cloth, or first pick of the best ice bricks each season. But mostly they did it because, well, someone had to. The actual didn't maintain itself, and it needed love. And now and then, during especially hot summers or long winters, people remembered just how important Reza was. On the first day of Turgon, the summer water festival, the elders would come to the Yakshul and bring him pomegranates and pistachios. Someone would recite a poem. Child might shyly offer a bowl of sherbet, cooled with fresh ice, and Reza would nod, his eyes soft but tired, and accept it all without fuss. Because tomorrow, he'd be back at work. There are stories half-truths, probably of these caretakers developing a sixth sense for weather. Reza once told his neighbor, "The ice will break early this year," and sure enough, a warm front arrived just 10 days later. Another time a merchant insisted it was safe to haul ice to the capital, but Reza said no. 2 hours outside the village, the merchant's entire load melted under a freak dust storm. Should have listened to Uncle Icehouse, people murmured, but it wasn't magic. It was observation. Reza noticed the behavior of ants when rain was coming. He studied the color of evening clouds, the speed of birds, the mood of goats. The land spoke to him, and he very patiently listened. Historians still debate the role these stewards played in wider society. Were they respected, or simply tolerated? Did they have apprentices, or were they lone eccentrics? The evidence is slim, but oral tradition suggests that in many towns, they were regarded as semi-sacred figures, not religious, but respected for keeping balance. Not between gods and men, but between heat and survival. And of course not all of them were men. In some areas, especially where the Yakshul served a shrine or community kitchen, women were deeply involved in its upkeep. Mothers passed on cooling tricks to daughters. Wrap the herbs in damp cloth, they'd say. Store your yogurt near the base, not the sides. And never, ever open the dome at noon. So you begin to see it now. The Yakshul wasn't tea, just a building. It was part of a living memory. A structure shaped not only by physics and stone, but by fingertips and stories. You crouch now by the base of the dome, where a few hardy weeds have sprouted between ancient bricks. Perhaps one of them grew from seeds dropped by Reza's lunch decades ago. Perhaps his sandal brushed this exact spot after a long day of tending cold. And as the sun rises higher, casting a warm gold against the dome's dusty flanks, you feel. It's that layered connection, the lineage of care. Not dramatic. It's not loud, just consistent, like the Yakshul itself. Silent, cool, steady. The desert is beginning to stir now, a faint rustle of motion on the wind. Somewhere behind a distant hill, a donkey brays. The kettle clinks on a stone hearth. But here, by the dome, all remains quiet, at least for now. You're thinking about legacy, because if there's one thing that persists in the dust of history, even when the names fade and the cities crumble, it's the ingenuity that endures long after. And Yakshuls, they didn't disappear. Not really. They just went to sleep for a while. Let's talk about what happened after the golden age of the Yakshul. For centuries, he stood proudly in villages and towns, storing ice, preserving food, chilling drinks for weddings and funerals alike. But then modernity arrived, one humming electric wire at a time. In the early 20th century, Persian Iran began embracing industrial technologies. Railroads cut across deserts, cities swelled. Refrigerators, once rare and mysterious, became a sign of urban comfort. And just like that, the old domes started to fall silent. No one intended to abandon them. They just stopped needing them. Why break your back hauling ice at 4 a.m. when a humming steel box in your kitchen could chill your yogurt just fine? Many Yakshuls were left to the elements, baked, cracked, filled with debris. Some were demolished to make way for highways or apartment blocks. Others, more mercifully, were simply forgotten, swallowed slowly by time and sand, but not all. In certain towns, Kerman Yazd, maybe the locals, kept them standing. Not for ice, maybe, but for memory. Children were still told stories about Uncle Icehouse. Tour guides began to bring curious visitors, especially those from colder countries who found the idea of desert refrigeration wonderfully strange. And then something remarkable has happened. The world started to heat up. Suddenly those old domes didn't seem so outdated anymore. They seemed ... smart. Across the globe, architects and engineers facing rising temperatures began to dig through ancient texts, study old blueprints, and visit half-collapsed Yakshuls with notepads in hand. Could these 1,500-year-old structures be adapted to solve modern problems? Turns out yes. In India, experimental stupas began appearing in Ladakh, inspired by Persian techniques. In Iran, architects launched sustainable cooling projects using dome geometry and passive airflow. In the United States, green building enthusiasts referenced yakshal designs when creating off-grid homes in arid climates. Even high-tech firms began exploring phase-change cooling systems, which if you squint sound an awful lot like freezing water in a basin overnight and storing it for later use. Historians still argue whether these revivals are direct continuations or inspired reinventions. What's not up for debate is this: the core ideas work. Nature, when understood deeply, remains the best engineer. You wander around the back of the dome now, where a section of the plaster is chipped away. Inside the crack, you see the original brick rough, sun-baked, still strong. Maybe it's your imagination, but the wall seems to pulse with quiet pride. Told you I'd last, it seems to say. And you start to wonder, what else have we overlooked? What other ancient solutions lie waiting, buried under asphalt and amnesia? Because the actual wasn't the only miracle of old Persian design. There were Connaught's underground canals stretching for miles, bringing water from mountain springs to thirsty cities without a single pump. There were wind towers, those graceful, chimney-like structures that caught desert breezes and funneled them into homes, cooling rooms without electricity. Together, these formed a network, a desert infrastructure, silent, sustainable, and deeply human. Imagine living in a home cooled by air moving through a Connaught tunnel, drinking water stored in a clay jar nestled in a yakshal chamber. No carbon emissions, no noise, no breakdowns. Just earth, air, water, and time. It sounds idyllic, almost like fiction, but it was real, and it might be real again. In fact, one Iranian university recently hosted a conference entirely devoted to traditional Persian architecture. Guess what got top billing? It's our old friend, the actual you. Grin now, imagining a room full of engineers with tablets and laptops, gathered around a scale model made of clay and straw. Somewhere in that room, Reza the caretaker would have felt very smug indeed. Because the truth is, cleverness doesn't age. Good ideas don't spoil. They wait, quietly, in domes, in bricks, in the cool places we forget until the world grows warm again. And now, as you lean against the wall, morning light spilling across your feet, you realize something quietly profound. The yakshal isn't just a chapter in history, it's a letter to the future. You take a slow breath and let the thought linger. A letter to the future. The idea is oddly comforting, isn't it? That a humble dome made of mud and straw, built by hands long gone, could still be speaking to you to tomorrow. To a world scrambling for balance again. But before we finish our time here, let's shift our focus inward, deeper into the dome knot. To its structure or trade value, but to its soul, if you'll allow such a word. Because the yakshal wasn't too only utilitarian. In some corners of Persia, it held symbolic weight. 2. Let's drift now into the space between function and faith. Start with the idea of balance. In Zoroastrianism, an ancient religion that once dominated Persian life, the world is shaped by duality, heat and cold, light and dark, creation and destruction. It's not about one triumphing over the other, it's about harmony. And if ever a building embodied that dance between opposites, it was the yakshal. Imagine walking inside from the desert's glare, your eyes adjusting to darkness, your skin tingling from the sudden drop in temperature. You are, quite literally, stepping from one state of being into another. Historians still argue whether the earliest yakshals had formal religious use, but many agree they carried spiritual associations. Some were built near fire temples, where the sacred flame burned night and day. Others were adjacent to cemeteries, where the air around the dome seemed to hold memory. And then there's the matter of the well. In the deepest part of some yakshals, a narrow shaft led to a cistern, a dark circular well that gathered meltwater and rain. Locals sometimes left small offerings there: coins, flower petals, or scraps of cloth tied with whispered prayers. Not for the dome exactly, but for the blessing of coolness. The gift of relief in a place of extremes. You can almost hear them, can't you? Those quiet prayers in the dark, not dramatic, not desperate, just small hopes folded into silence. In some rural communities, elderly women would gather children near the dome to tell stories, not only about how the Yakshal worked, but about what it meant. One story told of a village saved from illness because the Yakshal preserved snow from a freak winter storm. Another claimed the dome had once breathed during an eclipse, exhaling mist into the sky. Of course, we know the science now. We can explain the condensation, the airflow, the pressure differentials, but that doesn't make the stories less true, because meaning doesn't always need logic. Sometimes the ritual matters more than the reason. You circle slowly around the dome, noticing carvings in the old bricks, some likely decorative. Others perhaps graffiti from long-forgotten teenagers who dared each other to sleep inside the dome overnight. One symbol catches your eye, a stylized star enclosed in a circle. Maybe it was a charm. Maybe it was someone's idea of a cosmic seal. Maybe it was just a doodle. But the fact that it's still here, that it outlived the hands, that etched it feels strangely holy. In a few places, yakshals were used ceremonially. During Nowruz, the Persian New Year, elders would retrieve the last shard of winter's ice and place it into a communal bowl of water. Everyone would take a sip, one last taste of cold, before the new cycle began. It wasn't medicine. It wasn't superstition. It was symbolic. A reminder that time flows, that heat comes and goes, that no state is permanent, and if that's not spiritual, what is? You sit now at the base of the dome, letting the morning sun creep over your shoulders. You think of all the thresholds this place is marked: winter to spring, heat to cold, tradition to technology, prayer to science, and in the middle of it all, quiet continuity. You don't need to believe in sacred geometry or divine cooling to be moved by this. Sometimes, reverence lives in simplicity, in the shape of a wall, in the curve of a vent, in the stillness of cool air where there should be none. Because the Yakshal, in all its dry silence, doesn't preach anything, just is present, grounded, patient. And maybe that's its deepest gift, not the ice, not the preservation, not the architectural marvel, but the feeling it leaves. With you, that even in a harsh world, we can build pockets of peace. The sun now rides fully above the horizon, casting long, amber light over the landscape. The dome's shadows shrink with each passing minute, but the coolness inside still lingers like the final exhale of a deep breath. You step back once, more into its shadow, drawn now not by curiosity, but by comfort, by now. You've walked the Yakshal in nearly every way, through its engineering, its rituals, its caretakers, its seasons, its stories. But there's one final layer to peel back, a layer that doesn't sit neatly in books or under domes. It sits in memory, in living memory. Let's talk about what remains, not the structure. Necessarily, although several still stand, tired but proud, scattered across Iran's plateau. But the idea of the Yakshal, the feeling of it, is that strange, serene calm that settles around a space designed not for show, but for shelter. You see, in modern Iran, people haven't forgotten the Yakshal, even if they no longer rely on it. For their daily needs, it lives on in language, in metaphor, and even in poetry. In Farsi, to say someone is as calm as a Yakshal is to praise their cool-headedness. It's not a flashy compliment, but it's a deep one. The kind of phrase said softly with respect. In small towns, old-timers still use the Yakshal as a point of orientation. Turn left where the dome used to be, they'll say. Or, he lives 2 streets past the ice house. Even when the dome is gone, its location remains a ghost landmark still directing the living. There are even children's songs, gentle little rhymes about Yakshals, keeping summer sweet, with lines that rhyme ice and paradise in the native tongue. Historians still argue whether these references hold cultural weight or if they're just nostalgic remnants. But ask someone from Cormon or Yazd, and you'll see a flicker of recognition, like remembering a dream you didn't know you'd had in architecture schools. 2. The dome is back in fashion. Students sketch variations of the actual on tracing paper, testing how it might translate to a modern context. Domed homes. Off-grid, food storage, cooling systems that whisper rather than hum. One student reportedly described the Yakshal as the most polite machine ever built. You can't help but smile at that. It's true, isn't it? It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't demand. It simply waits until it's needed. Even in art, the image persists. Recreate its iconic shape in miniature. Photographers stage surreal desert shoots around half-buried domes. One poet compared the Yakshal to an ear pressed against the silence of centuries. That one stays with you. And yet, despite this quiet revival, the dome is also slipping fading grain by grain. Some stand abandoned, riddled with graffiti, or filled with wind-blown plastic bags. Others are misidentified by tourists as weird mosques or giant ovens. But here's the beautiful thing. The Yakshal doesn't seem to mind. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't fight for relevance. Just exists, rooted, stoic. A kind of architectural humility that's deeply rare in the world today. You run your hand along the base of the wall once more, and the brick feels neither warm nor cold, just there. Not trying to impress you, not trying to perform. Just being solid, textured, timeless. And maybe that's the most profound lesson that Yakshal has left behind. That survival isn't always about domination or speed. Sometimes it's about listening, adapting, holding still in the heat of things. As you begin to walk away now, the dome receding behind you, you realize it hasn't really left you at all. You'll carry its hush, its calm, its slow wisdom wherever you go. In the buzz of your refrigerator, in the hum of your fan. In the pause you take before stepping into sun, the Yakshal reminds you, even in the harshest conditions, it's possible to make space for softness. Your footsteps grow quieter now. The desert beneath you feels less like a place and more like a mood, vast, warm, slow-moving. The kind of place where time isn't measured in minutes, but in shadows. And the Yakshal, that dome of stillness and ingenuity, is behind you now, but never far from mind. This final stretch of our journey isn't about new facts or timelines. It's about what lingers, what stays with you once the dust settles, once the story slows, once the chill of ancient ice begins to melt back into memory. Let's imagine something together, one last time. You're walking through a town that hasn't existed on any modern map for 100 years. Clay buildings lean inward like old men whispering secrets. A narrow path winds past shuttered homes and the husks of dried pomegranate trees. And there it is again. The dome half-dash buried, cracked. A little tired, but unmistakable. You push open. A wooden gate with one hinge still hanging on, and step into the Yakshal's quiet shade. Inside, you find the pit dry now. The air carries a strange calm, thick with the scent of dust, plaster, something almost metallic, like forgotten memory. You sit, and for a while nothing happens. No tourists, no lessons, no timelines to tick off. Just the silence of a structure that has seen more summers than any person alive. A structure built by hands that were long gone before anyone spoke the word refrigerator. And you think about that idea again, that the Yakshal is not a monument to ice, but to patience, to people who understood their land, to people who didn't try to conquer nature but coexist with it, to people who saw winter not as a threat, but as a gift you could bottle and save. Historians still debate the specifics, how many domes were active in the 1700s, which regions used what materials, whether the original builders were inspired by other civilizations. But in the face of all that noise, the Yakshal itself is silent, confident, as if to say, you don't need to understand every detail to appreciate what was done here. You run a hand over a brick and feel how the edges have softened with time. Just like the story, and just like you, as you begin to relax deeper into this final chapter, because really, the Yakshal has told you everything it needed to tell. Not with grandeur, not with urgency, but with steady breath. So now, let it all settle. Let the details melt into each other like the last layer of ice on a warm morning. Let the names blur. The dates dissolve, the facts grow fuzzy at the edges. Let what remains be the feeling that in a harsh world, someone once built something gentle, and it worked. Word count, 1009. Wind down 300 words so now. You've walked the full circle from blazing deserts to shaded domes. From ancient ice to timeless silence, let your thoughts drift. Soft and aimless. Maybe you picture Reza, our imagined caretaker, lighting a small oil lamp as night falls, and checking his dome one last time. The wind rises around him, tugging at his cloak, but he moves slow and certain. He doesn't rush. He never has. Maybe you picture the children of the village, barefoot and giggling, sneaking pebbles into the freezing pools before dawn, only to find them trapped in ice by mourning tiny treasures in a frozen mosaic. Or maybe you're just seeing the dome itself. Alone, quiet, patient, still standing, even now, while the world spins faster and faster around it. It's okay to forget the technical bits. You don't need to remember surge, or thermal convection, or vent. Placement. What matters is how it made you feel. Cool.com, rooted. Let your breath slow down now. Inhale like a breeze slipping through a dome's narrow vent. Exhale like warmth, leaving a wall that stored night's chill. There's nothing more to do tonight, no final lesson, no conclusion. Just the gentle truth that even in the middle of the world's hottest places, someone once found a way to make space for stillness. And now so have you. Sleep well.